Thank you for having this hearing, and I hope they continue. Actually, they should be every month, really, given the turnout tonight. I want to bring a little history tonight into the discussion because I think it's important. In the 1950s, there was a redevelopment project. It's called the Broadway Redevelopment Project. It was 39 acres, just west of Hopkins. It dislocated or displaced over 1,100 families. There's some people in the room tonight who remember that. That project was a project that was supported by the city, the state, federal dollars, and Johns Hopkins. It resulted in the expansion of Hopkins. In its place, there was a graduate student building built. There was apartments for staff. There was a professional building. There was parking. And there was a hotel. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? There were also promises made that those over 1,000 families could return and that they would build apartments. It would have been the first time new buildings were built for African American people. After people were relocated, they were told there was no more money and that those apartments wouldn't be built. They collected surveys from the Hopkins staff and students, found out what they would like to see in those 39 acres, and they fulfilled their needs. That happened because there was city, state, federal support of Hopkins. Now we fast forward to 2001. 88 acres this time, not 39. This time it's just north of Hopkins. And it's the same kind of community. It's African American, historic people who have been there their entire lives, some. They're low income, they're working poor. They've been living in a community where for 50 years the major employer, actually for 70 years, the major employer was Johns Hopkins. And the major landlord for 30 of those years was Johns Hopkins. And now the city and the state and the federal support is also there. But now it comes in the form of EBDI, because now we're a little bit more smart in looking at how a city does business with private. So now we have EBDI as the front structure to carry out the wishes of the private corporation, the Johns Hopkins Medical Institution. And then you have promises, but with no input from residents. Every single thing that have been won over the last 10 years in this project has been won because of residents raising their voice, struggling, becoming sick, being traumatized, being unable to return to the community. It has not been easy for residents. Not one thing that has come. The project started with residents being told that they could only relocate into a certain area to get the relocation assistance. Basically segregation in the year 2002 in Baltimore City. Nothing really new to Baltimore. That changed because residents raised their voices. The demolition also changed because residents raised their voices. And the commitment to 1/3 affordable housing came only because residents held them accountable, brought attorneys to the table, and made them sit down and make promises. The only problem, it wasn't legal. It wasn't written in any document. So now they can't be held accountable to it. So a process like this really needs to hold them accountable to that 1/3 of affordable, medium, and market rate housing. Those were the promises. And there's lots of documentation to show that. Those promises need to be adhered to. The changing master plan has always been changing. The first plan was uninformed by residents. In 2001, when the announcement came to use eminent domain, residents were not at the table. They were not informed. People learned about it through the newspaper. That was not right. It's not right today. When the third master plan was announced, residents had no input. Surveys came from the majority, again, of Hopkins. It's the same thing 60 years later. And what is so sad is that we haven't changed. We've camouflaged things. We've brought people in with different colors to do the work. but we're doing the same thing. And what we really need to think about is a question that has been going around the room, is who's to benefit from this project? When asked the question from several stakeholders, was this project ever to look at poverty? Was it ever to really look at reducing poverty in East Baltimore? Consistently, no. And so the stories you're hearing tonight go along with that intention from the beginning. The project was never intended to benefit residents of East Baltimore. The project was intended to do the same thing the 1950s project did, to expand the institution that's very powerful, to make sure that its staff, its students, its faculty feel safe walking outdoors, to make sure that there's a park that everyone can play in, to make sure that there are businesses that people who work, live, and are associated with that institution are able to go and feel like it's part of their home. I was a student at Hopkins, and I used to help do recruiting for students of color. And one of the reasons that some of the brightest minds wouldn't come to Hopkins was because they were afraid of the community next door. So when they would come for interviews, which is a huge process, they would come and they'd be happy with the institution, but they would always ask the question, how can an institution like this let the community around them deteriorate? And they wouldn't come because of that. That's always been a huge problem for the Hopkins institution. The institution cannot afford to live next to poverty. And so it will change that. And it will change it in the guise of using eminent domain. It will change it in the guise of helping some people in East Baltimore. But you have to honestly think about it. With $564 million spent so far, with all the brilliant minds that are there and all the contracts and funds, with the foundations that have put money in, how come more people of Middle East and East Baltimore haven't benefited? And the answer is crystal clear. It was never meant for them to benefit. The intention was to get rid of them and to create an image that would make the people in the ivory tower of Hopkins feel comfortable. Mm-hmm. When I was at Hopkins, I was told the first day at orientation as a student, don't go outside the Hopkins borders. It's dangerous out there. That's what's told to everyone who goes to Hopkins. What we have is a separation between the powerful ones and the ones that have less power. Oh. And that separation, that division has allowed that powerful institution to build itself, to grow itself, to use its prestige, to build and expand. It's expanded from 14.5 acres in 1889 to over 60 acres in 2011. And it will continue to expand. You might not want to call the 88 acres an expansion of Hopkins, but when you create something that looks like you and doesn't look anything like what was there before, what you have done is you've decimated history and you have promulgated yourself. Thank you.